Westminster Abbey by Joseph Edison. In the last class, I gave you an introduction about Joseph Edison and also about Westminster Abbey, about the church. I had spoken to you about the Spectator Club and the imaginary character created by Joseph Edison and Richard Steele named Mr. Spectator. So in this essay written by Joseph Edison, we see how Mr. Spectator goes around Westminster Abbey. He goes to the places, especially he looks at the tombs of the people buried there. And it is a very reflective essay. So he reflects on life, on the concept of death and things like that. So we'll just read the essay and I'll explain it as I read it, right? So it starts, this essay starts with a quote from Horace, from Horace's Ode, right? So it's given in Latin. The translation goes like this: pale death with foot impartial tramples down the man's cot, the kingly tower and throne, thrice happy Cestius. Life's brief span denies far-reaching hopes and flattering auguries. Long night awaits us all, the ghostly crew and Pluto's gloomy mansions loom in view. So this is from Horace's Odes, and this gives us an introduction. So while we read this, we understand that we are going to speak about death and what is the concept of death and what exactly is death? What does death bring in its wake? So this is just an introductory note because the writer wants to give an introduction to what this essay is going to be. So reading this introduction from Horace, we understand that Joseph Addison is definitely going to speak about death, the concept of death, what happens when people die. He's going to speak about the life after, you pass away from this world. When you're in the tomb, what happens then? So that's how this starts. Then he goes on like this, and this is, Mr. Spectator. He's actually, we see that Mr. Spectator, an imaginary character, is going around Westminster Abbey. So these are his thoughts, right? So it goes like this: when I am in serious humor, I very often walk by myself in Westminster Abbey, where the gloominess of the place and the use to which it is applied, with the solemnity of the building and the condition of the people who lie in it, are apt to fill the mind with a kind of melancholy or rather thoughtfulness that is not disagreeable. So he says, when I'm in very serious humor, when I'm in a reflective thought, or when I'm in a reflective, pensive mood, I very often walk by myself in Westminster Abbey. So he says, I go by myself, I go alone, because I want to collect my thoughts. I want to think about life. I want to think about what happens after one dies. And he speaks about the gloominess of the place. The place looks very gloomy because a lot of people are buried there. And the use to which it is applied. What is the Westminster Abbey basically used for? According to Joseph Addison, it was used to bury important people. With the solemnity of the building is very solemn, very serious looking building, and the condition of the people who lie in it. So when you think about all these things, one is the place looks very gloomy and it is usually used as a burial ground. The building is very solemn looking or very serious looking, and the condition of the people who lie in it, the people who are buried in it, what has happened to those people? When you think about all these things, what happens is your mind is filled with a kind of melancholy. You feel very, upset about it. Maybe you say, he says, I feel very sad about it. There's a kind of melancholic thought in my mind. He says, more than melancholy, it can be thoughtfulness. I think, I devise thinking, or I put on my thinking cap and I start reflecting. I start reflecting on the process called life. And he says, this is not disagreeable, right? This melancholy or this kind of thoughtfulness, it is not something that is bad. It actually enables us to think about a lot of things. Think about what life is all about, right? I yesterday passed a whole afternoon in the churchyard, the cloisters, and the church, amusing myself with the tombstones and the inscriptions that I met within those several regions of the dead. So he dead. So he says that the previous day afternoon he had spent an entire afternoon in the church here. He walked through the cloisters, he walked through the church, he looked at the tombstones, he looked at the inscriptions that were written on the tombstones, and he said, there are so many things written about the people buried there. Most of them recorded nothing else of the buried person, but that he was born upon one day and died upon another. So he says, I read all the tombstones. And in most of the tombstones, I saw that in some tombstones, there was something written about the person. But in most of the tombstones, what I saw was just the date of birth and the date of death. So he says, it was as if the whole history of his life being comprehended in those two circumstances that are common to all mankind. It was as though the entire life of the person buried there was actually pressed between these two dates, or just existed between these 2 days. There was nothing beyond the dates that were given on the inscriptions. There was nothing else about that person. So when you looked at the tombstones and you looked at the person, the name of the person, the only thing you would know about that person was that the person was born on this particular date and he died on this particular date. It was as though his life was actually confined within these 2 days. There was nothing beyond this. And this is something which we see in most of the tombstones. So when a person dies, what about that person's life? How does another person know what this person was? The only thing that is given on tombstones are the dates, the date of birth and the date of death. It's as though his entire life is squeezed between these two dates. I could not but look upon these registers of existence, whether of brass or marble, as a kind of satire upon the departed persons. So he says, there were some tombstones which are made of brass, some tombstones made of marble, and he says, I had to look upon these things with a little bit of contempt in my mind. It was a little bit of satirical reaction from my side, because there was nothing else except for these dates. It was as though you were making fun of these people. These people have lived for many years. They must have done a lot of things, but nothing about that person is mentioned. Only thing is this date and that date, as though his entire life is kind of squeezed, just kind of confined to these two dates. So he says it's a kind of satire. It's as though you're making fun of that person, about that departed person. Okay, you will have memorial stones of brass, sometimes it will be of marble, but that doesn't matter, because that does not give you any idea about the person who is buried there. They put me in mind of several persons mentioned in the battles of heroic poems, who have sounding names given to them for no other reason but that they may be killed and are celebrated for nothing but being knocked on the head. So he says these people who are buried here, they have left no other memorial for themselves except the day they were born and the day they died. So he says, when I read that and I look at these memorials, what comes to my mind is many people who have been mentioned in great heroic poems like Iliad, like the Odyssey, like Aeneid. So he says, there are huge poems or heroic poems, and you see big names, high sounding names, but what do these high sounding names actually do? I mean, there's nothing much mentioned about them except that they have killed someone, or somebody has killed them, or somebody has knocked them on their heads. Nothing beyond that. So he says, just like heroic poems have high sounding characters with high sounding names, similar, who actually do nothing, right? Similarly, the people who are buried in Westminster Abbey have nothing written about them except the date of their birth and the date of their death. So he goes on to say something about Homer and something about Virgil, right? So he speaks about Virgil's Aeneid, he speaks about Homer's Odyssey and Iliad, and he says, in all these heroic poems, there have been mentioned big names, high sounding names. He speaks about it's in Latin. He speaks about Glaucomach, Medontac, Tersil Kumuk, and all these names. And he says these names are very high sounding. But what has happened to these people? What have they done? They have either killed somebody or somebody has killed them. And ultimately, all these three heroes whom Virgil and even Homer mentions, Homer is Greek and Virgil is Latin, right? So in both these, some people say Virgil's Aeneid is actually a reflection of or a copy of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. So he says, these three characters are dead. They talk about the Trojan War. They are heroes of the Trojan War. They are dead. So what else do you know? That they have been killed by someone, right? Somebody has hit them on the head and they are dead. Nothing else, but they have such high sounding names. Similarly, here you have such big memorial stones, sometimes marble, sometimes brass, and what is written on them? Nothing except the date of birth and the date of death. And he says the life of these men with these characters with high sounding names, the life of these men is finally described in the Holy Writ by the path of an arrow which is immediately closed up and lost. He speaks about a book in the Bible, the Wisdom of Solomon, and this quote is from that. He says, or like as when an arrow is shot at a mark, it parteth the air, which immediately cometh together again, so that a man cannot know where it went through. Even so we, in like manner, as soon as we were born, draw to our end, and had no sign of virtue to show, but were consumed in our own wickedness. So he says, it's just like this, just like an arrow goes and parts the arrow. What happens? We don't know from where we have come, and we are born, and then by the time we start living, we draw our end. So, this is what happens. These men have such high sounding names, but they have just left the earth as they came. They came in for some time, just like the arrow goes and parted the air. So that is from the Holy Writ. So he says the Holy Writ is the Bible. So he makes a quote from the Bible, from the book of Wisdom of Solomon, right? Verses 12 and 13. That is from where this passage has been taken, or this line has been taken. So what he says is, just like an arrow parted the air, just like that, these men come and they just leave, right? So that's what he says here. Now he goes on, upon my going into the church, I entertained myself with the digging of a grave, and saw in every shovelful of it that was thrown up, the fragment of a bone or skull intermixed with a kind of fresh mouldering earth that sometime or other had a place in the composition of a human body. So he says, I went into the church, then I started digging up a grave. And he said that every shovel is a kind of tool with which you pull out the earth, or you kind of dig the earth. So he says, saw in every shovel, because I was digging the grave, and every shovelful of earth that was thrown out, I saw a fragment of a bone or a skull intermixed with a kind of fresh mouldering earth that sometime or other had a place in the composition of a human body. So once upon a time, this skull or this bone had a place in the human body. Now it has been buried, it's decomposed. So the moment I start digging the grave, along with the earth, what I see is maybe a fragment of a bone or a piece of skull that is mixed with the earth, and it comes up as soon as I shovel the grave. Upon this, I began to consider with myself what innumerable multitudes of people lay confused together under the pavement of that ancient cathedral, how men and women, friends and enemies, priests and soldiers, monks and prebendaries were crumbled amongst one another and blended together in the same common mass, how beauty and strength and youth with old age, weakness and deformity lay undistinguished in the same promiscuous heap of matter. So he says, I began to consider the different multitudes of people who lay confused together under the pavement of this ancient cathedral. So once upon a time, they were all different kind of people, right? But today, they're all lying under the pavement of this cathedral. They're all mixed together, right? And he says they're all lying confused. So Men and women, see, this is in those days, men and women would never kind of lie together unless you're husband and wife. So what happened is, here he says men and women, they have been buried together, men and women, friends and enemies, people who were friends together on earth, people who are enemies on earth, now they're all together, right? Friends and enemies, priests and soldiers, two different kind of people, monks and prebendaries. Monks are people who live a very frugal life, whereas prebendaries are resident clergymen who enjoy the revenue of the cathedral, right? So monks and prebendaries, when alive, they don't get along together. But once they are dead, they're all under the cathedral. They're all under the pavement. They're all together. But all crumbled amongst one another. So these people, when alive, who would never get along with each other, now they're all together. Right? Men and women, men and women would never come together when alive, unless they were married. But now you see all of them are under this cathedral, under the pavement of this cathedral, all mixed together. Men and women, friends and enemies, priests and soldiers, monks and prebendaries, they're all crumbled amongst one another and blended together in the same common mass. So all the bodies are decomposed and the bones have got mixed, so you don't know which is whose grave. So everybody is together under the earth, right? How beauty, strength, youth with old age, weakness, deformity lay undistinguished in the same promiscuous heap of matter. So he says, when you were alive, you would have been strong, some would have been weak, some would have been beautiful, some would have been ugly, some would have been would have some deformity on their body, some would be very old, some would be very young, but now what? Now you cannot distinguish. They cannot be distinguished. They're all undistinguished in the same promiscuous heap of matter. So what he says, it's not carefully chosen. The graves, you choose your graves and you bury these people. Then what happens? But after some time, there is decomposition, right? And once a body is decomposed, they get mixed, it's mixed with the earth, and there is no distinction between whether you were old or whether you were young or whether you were beautiful or whether you were deformed, whether you were strong or whether you were weak. No distinction at all. Underneath the pavement of the cathedral or underneath in the earth, once you're buried, there is no distinction at all. So he says people make a lot of distinction when they're alive, right? When they're living on this earth, they make a lot of distinction, right? And they try to make so much of comparisons with each other. But once you are dead, then what happens is there is no distinction at all. See, whether you are beautiful or whether you are ugly, it makes no difference at all. All of you are together. So that's what he says, death brings us like this. So death will not, death is, it's a leveler. It's a leveler. It makes everybody equal. Now he continues, after having thus surveyed this great magazine of mortality, as it were in the lump, I examined it more particularly by the accounts which I found on several of the monuments which are raised in every quarter of that ancient fabric, right? So he goes on to say, after having thus surveyed this great magazine of mortality would mean the structure of death, right? This big, huge cathedral, and underneath the cathedral, so many people buried. This great magazine of mortality, as it were in the lump. Now it's just one lump. You don't know who, you cannot distinguish between anyone. It's all a lump. Then he says, I examined it more particularly. So he started going about it very carefully. He started examining it very carefully by the accounts which I found in several of the monuments which are raised in every quarter of the ancient fabric. So he says, and I started studying it because I saw a few accounts on several of the monuments. And there are many monuments raised. And I started studying what was written on them. There are some monuments which had something written, right? Some of them were covered with such extravagant epitaphs that if it were possible for the dead person to be acquainted with them, he would blush at the praises which his friends have bestowed upon him. So he says, there are certain tombstones which have wonderful epitaphs. Epitaphs are the writings on the tombstone. So he says, there are certain tombstones which have such wonderful, extravagant epitaphs that if it were possible for the dead person to be acquainted with them, he would blush at the praises which his friends have bestowed upon him. So, some of these epitaphs are so well written. It praise that person, praise the dead person so much that if the dead person were to come to life and read the epitaph about himself, he would blush. He would wonder, is it really about me that my friends have written? You know why? People always have a tendency to glorify the dead. We all do that. When person dies, we glorify that person. When that person is alive, we hardly say anything about that person. Right? So that is actually it's a problem that human beings have. Or, it's a kind of foible, or you can say a kind of weakness that human beings have. When a person is alive, you hardly praise that person. But when that person dies, whether he's good or bad, you kind of bestow so much of praises. So it is this tendency of glorifying the dead is a human tendency. So what Joseph Addison says is, if this dead man were to come to life and he would be able to read this epitaph, he would blush in shame because he would wonder, is it really me? Was I such a good person? Right? So he says there are others so excessively modest that they deliver the character of the person departed in Greek or Hebrew, and by that means are not understood once in a 12-month. And then he's satirical. It's an irony. He says, it's satirical. He's ironically saying there are others so excessively modest. Modest means simple, but this is irony. So he says there are some epitaphs that are so simple that the character of the person is written in Greek or Hebrew. Now, who knows how to read Greek or Hebrew? Only the people who are elite or the very well-educated people. The common man cannot read Greek or Hebrew, right? So he says there are some epitaphs which are so modest. So that's ironic. Irony. So it's ironical. It's an irony. So he's actually taking a dig at that. So he says there are certain epitaphs written in Greek and Hebrew that that are not understood once in 12 months. That means not even once a year you'll be able to understand what is written. So what he's doing is, what he's saying here is, he is actually taking a dig at these people who furnish such extravagant epitaphs. Sometimes it will be too much praising the person. Sometimes some epitaphs will be written in Greek and Hebrew, which you have no understanding about, which you have no idea about, right? So he says, this is what I was trying to read, and I was trying to study these epitaphs, right? In the poetical quarter, the area where the poets were buried, I found there were poets who had no monuments and monuments which had no poets. So he said, I went around studying these tombstones and the epitaphs, and in the poets' corner where the poets were buried, I found that there were some poets buried who had no monuments, and there were some monuments where there were no poets buried. So he says it was such an irony, I observed, indeed, that the present war had filled the church with many of these uninhabited monuments, which had been erected to the memory of persons whose bodies were perhaps buried in the plains of Blenheim or in the bosom of the ocean. Now he speaks about poets without monuments. He goes on to explain. He says, I found that there were certain poets without any monuments and certain monuments without any poets or without any bodies. The reason is there was a war going on, right? Especially the War of Spanish Succession in 1704. And as a result of this war, many people were killed, or many of the soldiers were dead. And these monuments, which had no poets or which had no bodies, had been erected to the memories of those soldiers or those people whose bodies were perhaps buried in the plains of Blenheim or in the bosom of the ocean. So now he says, he speaks about the Battle of Blenheim, which took place in 1704. It was actually the most famous victory of the first Duke of Marlborough, John Churchill, and Eugene of Savoy. It is called the War of the Spanish Succession. And it was in this War of the Spanish Succession that the French army suffered a major defeat. They had never been defeated. Maybe over 50 years, they had never been defeated. But this was one of the first wars, first major defeat that the French army faced. And this was actually to preserve the alliance of England, Austria, and the United Provinces against France. And Bavaria. So what happened is this war of Spanish succession knocked out Bavaria of the war, and France suffered a defeat. And many people lost their lives. So they had to be buried in this place called Blenheim, right? It is a place where this battle was taking place. So because these bodies could not be brought back to England or to the cathedral to be buried, what happened is people just erected monuments for them. So that is why he says there were some monuments without any poets or without any bodies, because these people had been buried in the plains of Blenheim, or maybe in the bosom of the ocean when the war was taking place. Even the navy, some of the ships were sunk and the people drowned. So the bodies were in the bottom of the ocean. So they could never recover the bodies of those soldiers who died fighting this battle. So it was a very famous battle, the War of Spanish Succession. And so these people a tribute had to be paid to them. So because their bodies could not be recovered, memorials were erected in their memory in the Westminster Abbey. So there were no bodies, but there were monuments. So he goes on to speak about that. So he speaks about the Poets' Corner, where you see poets without monuments and some of the monuments without poets, right? So I'll stop with that for now. We've got a little more to finish. I think 1 more hour and we should be able to finish that. Okay, thank you very much. I hope this is clear to you.